Yeah, thank you so much for letting me talk here today. I will just give some background to the talk that I've been involved in EFSA as an independent expert for a couple of years, and I have also been coordinating training in expert elicitation for EFSA as a tender, where some of you attending this meeting are also part of. So I based this talk on the experiences from this involvement and in the training. So first of all, what is the European Food Safety Authority? It's an authority at the EU level that are doing scientific assessments. And the scientific assessment usually is initiated by a request for a scientific advice from the European Commission, the European Parliament, or an EU member state. EFSA can also do things on their own initiative, such as they want to screen for emerging risks or develop some new guidances, etc., so-called self-tasking. And EFSA has a set of principles and practices on how they're going to do the assessments. They have rules and set up governance on how to ensure that the assessments they produce are independent and efficient. And they also rely heavily on external experts, which are supposed to be independent and not have any interest related to food safety. So there is also a lot of people working for EFSA at EFSA, like EFSA staff. So there is a combination of EFSA staff and independent external experts that are producing this scientific advice and the guidances to produce scientific advice together. And whenever they're working with scientific advice, it's usually reviewed as a public consultation, so the public can provide their input on the advice before it's getting adopted. Okay, so what I will talk about today is the guidance for expert knowledge elicitation, which was adopted 2014, so almost 10 years ago. And this guidance was initiated on a need to sort of, one saw that we are doing risk assessments and that the scientific advice should be based on available evidence. But since available evidence very often is limited, there is a need to also be able to use this evidence and fill data gaps by doing judgments. And it's better if these judgments are structured and formal than if they're not. There is also a need to make the judgments well defined and expressed. So EFSA defined expert knowledge elicitation as a systematic, documented and reviewable process to retrieve expert judgments from a group of experts in the form of a probability distribution. So in that sense, an expert knowledge elicitation, and I will call it EKI from here on, has these specific features. It's always involving a group of experts because when you produce scientific advice, you seldom rely on one individual expert. You have several experts with different competences coming together to produce a scientific opinion. And they also, when developing this guidance, they also saw that it's recommended that the judgments are expressed quantitatively, as it is less ambiguous than qualitative judgments. So it was then recommended that the judgments would be in form of a probability distribution. So the EFSA EKI guidance is then describing the process of expert knowledge elicitation in the context of the European Food Safety Authority. So they have a workflow which is describing who is responsible for which parts, who is going to make the decision of actually doing an EKI, and who is going to sort of plan the whole EKI process. And then they can have internal or external experts on elicitation that are supporting the so-called elicitation phase. And then there is, of course, documentation to be done. And this is then tailored to the different type of working groups, EFSA staff, external experts, and panels that are involved in producing scientific opinions at EFSA. The ICI guidance are then recommending or describing 3 different protocols or methods to do elicitation, where we have a group of experts. So the first one is the Sheffield protocol, which then are applying behavioral aggregation, and each expert make an individual judgment, and then one is discussing differences in judgments, one is sort of documenting rationales, and in this process of behavioral aggregation, at the end, one is going to the experts are going to agree on a consensus judgment. And then the second protocol is the Cook protocol. I'm a little bit afraid of describing it here to you, but just for the purpose of the talk, I can say that one is using seed questions to calibrate the experts, and then one is applying mathematical aggregation given the performance, how they perform on the seed questions. And then the third one is the Delphi protocol, which is then that the individual experts are providing their judgments, they get feedback, they don't really interact with other experts, they can refine their judgments based on the feedback they get, and so it's sort of a mixture between behavioral mathematical aggregation, one can say. When I look, because now when I've been working on producing these courses, one task has been to actually use existing EFSA examples to illustrate these different methods. I see that there are in principle only one or hardly applications of the Cook protocol, and there are some applications of Delphi protocol, and then there are several applications of the Sheffield protocol. But what has happened is that there are modifications of these protocols being done throughout EFSA, and this is something I will talk about today. So if we look at the different areas where expert elicitation has been done at EFSA's work, we have there's a lot of applications in non-regulated areas such as animal health and welfare and plant health. So I think that animal health and welfare and plant health are those areas where most expert elicitations have been carried out at EFSA. The reason for that can be that they have they were sort of trying out, implementing these methods. They have sort of used it in the context of describing uncertainty in the conclusion, and they were also having the freedom to test and see how it could be used. Then there are examples of ICI used in chemical contaminants in food and feed, and we have several examples in biological hazards where it's used to, in the original context of the EFSA ICI guidance, actually to inform parameters that goes into a quantitative model. And then we also see applications in GMO and in pesticides. Then there are other areas of EFSA's work where there are only a few examples or no examples at all so far. So here is an example of an EFSA ICI that has been done to evaluate the safety and efficacy of listics for reduction of pathogens on a different ready-to-eat food product. So this was done by the biological hazard panel. And you can see the link here in the presentation if you want to have a look at it. I take this as an example because it has a very good documentation in the appendix of the scientific opinion. And when we look at the applications of EKI at EFSA work, one can sort of clearly see when there is a thorough documentation, and it's usually put as an appendix to the overall scientific opinion. In other cases, it's mentioned that explicitation has been done, but the documentation is very sparse, or one cannot find it. So the application of the explicitations, they show quite a variety in how it's done, and sometimes it's referring to general guidance documents that are for that type of assessment. So then there is no need to put in the documentation in every opinion. But in other cases, one can find very thorough summaries of how the EKI was done. In this particular case, it sort of follows very closely the Sheffield method. And if one goes to the description of the EKI in the main text of the opinion, it refers to that it's using a simplified version of the Sheffield elicitation framework. And it refers to that there was limited time available in this mandate. So the EKI was conducted with an abbreviated version of the full EKI procedure. So it says that the EKI guidance, it is sort of describing how to do EKI, how to make it formal, so it should sort of be trustworthy application of structured expert judgment. But what they're saying here in this particular opinion is that we didn't have time to do this within the mandate. And then they refer to that this was more closer to something which is a semi-formal EKI process, which was then proposed in the drafted uncertainty guidance. So when this opinion was adopted in 2016, the uncertainty guidance had not been adopted yet, but the draft had been out for public consultation, so therefore they could refer to this. So here it also says that the semi-formal could be recommended in situations when time and resources are more limited. Okay. So what are these guidances for uncertainty analysis, the guidance for uncertainty analysis at EFSA? Well, it's actually two documents. So one document is the guidance as such, but all the sort of principle and method supporting the uncertainty guidance are actually in the scientific opinion called the principle and methods. And if you want to sort of understand how the what's behind the guidance for uncertainty, it's the document on principle and methods that one should read. So let me just give you some extract from it. So this is taken from the summary on how the scientific committee, when this was adopted in 2017, view on the use of uncertainty in scientific assessment at EFSA. So it's a fundamental principle in EFSA's work that the requirement of transparency in the scientific basis for its advice, including scientific uncertainty. So this means that all EFSA's scientific assessments must include considerations of uncertainties. And then one should also communicate clearly and unambiguously what uncertainties have been identified and what is their impact on the overall assessment outcome. So they say it's the responsibility of the scientific assessors to characterize this uncertainty, and then the decision makers have a responsibility to resolve this impact on their decision making. So EFSA's role is to provide scientific advice, but not actually to say how the advice or the presence of uncertainty should influence the decision making. That should be done. What also says here is that the how to then express uncertainty, the recommendation is that one should aim to express uncertainty in the conclusion, or this also known as overall uncertainty, quantitatively to the extent that is scientifically achievable. And this is also referring back to the World Health Organization principles for risk analysis. So it's in line with that. And what does this mean? Well, it means that one should sort of try to consider the combined impact of all sources of uncertainty. And if there are any source of uncertainty that the experts have not taken into account when they derive the final expression of uncertainty, one should sort of clearly state what those sources were. And it was also seen that first they had a trial period of the uncertainty analysis guidance, and there was concern raised that that it might not be relevant to do uncertainty analysis in all types of EFSA assessment. But the scientific committee, they sort of review these arguments, and they saw that no, this guidance on uncertainty is actually should be applied to all EFSA scientific assessments. And the key reasons for doing this is that the scientific conclusions should be based on evidence, and all evidence comes with uncertainty that affects this evidence, and the decision makers need to understand the degree of certainty or uncertainty affecting each assessment. And it also says that going back to the principles of transparency, that communicating this uncertainty is what it means to be transparent as well. And in certain areas, it could be that the risk managers or the legislation actually requires like a very firm conclusion. It's either positive or negative. But what one can do then is to agree like for what levels of certainty would the conclusion be positive or negative. So that's possible to accommodate that. It also says that having this said, we need to characterize uncertainty, the combined impact on the conclusion. Expert judgment is an essential part of the scientific assessments that needs to be done by EFSA. And that these expert judgments should, of course, then be elicited in a rigorous way and when appropriate, using a formal methodology. It also states that the probability is the preferred measure for expressing uncertainty, and that whenever we sit in a context of making an assessment, it is uncertainty in the conclusion that is the most important thing that one has to do in every case. And how one reach that could be different. So it could be that one actually starts with specifying uncertainty in various inputs that goes into models to help to use models to combine sources of uncertainty is really, really helpful. But even if one do that, there are sources of uncertainty that might not be possible to take into account in the modeling. So one has to make a judgment at the end anyway. Having that said, what we see is that given the limited time and resources that experts and EFSA have to these opinions, there is a tendency to sort of that one is doing the assessment of uncertainty at the very end, and one is missing the opportunity to use more quantitative modeling approaches to combine sources of uncertainty. And this could be a consequence that it takes time to first get used to using expert judgment in a formal way in assessments, and then to sort of prioritize where to use expert elicitation and to put effort on using it. Okay, so as you might think, we have something called formal EKI and something called semi-formal EKI. So in the guidance for uncertainty, or in the principle and methods, they are referring to, so how should this expert judgment be carried out? First, we have the formal EKI, which are the expert elicitation procedures that are described in the EFSA EKI guidance from 2014. But when they developed the uncertainty analysis guidance a couple of years later, they saw that there is a need to reduce the formalities of the EKI that was proposed in the EKI guidance. So therefore, they introduced this concept of semi-formal EKI. And it is a reduced and simplified version of the formal EKI. And it's sort of recommended to use this when there is insufficient time or resources to carry out the formal EKI. I will come back to that reason a little bit later. Okay. So what I think about is that the guidance for the EFSA guidance for IKI, it sort of describes something called minimal assessment and simple sensitivity analysis, which is a way to, you put something rough, some rough bounds on parameters and quantities, and then you sort of see which one has the most influence on the conclusion. The IKI guidance was it was sort of framed as you have a model and you have input parameters. But as you might understand, when we apply expert judgment, or not me, but when EFSA is applying expert judgment in scientific assessment, it does not always look like that. As I said, we might have models and input parameters, but we also have this step where we're going to take into account all sources of uncertainty on an output where we don't have any model. So the minimal assessment is applicable when we have these mathematical models to do the sensitivity analysis. The minimal assessment can then be used to screen for potentially important parameters, which could then be subject to formal IKI. So one can say that given the limited resources, formal IKI procedures should be done for the most important parameters. And then the uncertainty guidance then says that semi-formal IKI can be done where you don't have time to, you can do it on the intermediate important parameters. But if we go back and pause a minute, we saw that the judgments were to be made on the conclusion, which was actually the most important quantity of a scientific opinion. So the semi-formal IKI is also suggested as a method when anytime when we it's not only when we evaluate something which is of less importance, but it's like anytime when we deviate from the formal requirements in the EFSA IKI guidance. That's my suggestion in red there. So what do the principle and methods guidance say about this semi-formal IKI? What are the minimal requirements? Well, first it says it should be a predefined question, guaranteeing an unambiguous framing of the problem with regard to the expert ward, right? There should be a clearly defined group of experts, and their expertise should have been evaluated and reviewed, so they are experts for the intended question. They should have a basic training on making probability judgments. The available evidence should have been provided to the experts in a convenient form, and they should have the possibility to review it before they enter the elicitation process. And one should use an appropriate elicitation method, and which includes also aggregating across multiple experts. And the elicitation process for each question should be facilitated by a neutral person, a facilitator who is not contributing him or herself to the judgments on a question. And the results should be very clear, and one should describe not only the uncertainties in the answer, but also the reasonings behind the judgments. And that the elicitation should result in an explicit statement about the question or quantitative interest, and that the expression of the inherent certainties should be included either in quantitative or qualitative ways, and a summary of the reasoning. And if one is then doing any further calculations or conversions of the result, it should also be possible to trace this back. To me, this sounds very formal, I must say. And so they also say that semi-formal does not mean that it's not formal. It is sort of just relaxing some of the things that are in the IKI guidance. So what is actually being relaxed here? Well, what happens is actually when the semi-formal IKI is used, it's because the experts themselves are the members of the working groups or the panel at EFSA. So as you remember, the EFSA staff and independent external experts, they are working together to produce the scientific opinions. So in this case, one is not going outside EFSA searching for experts, one is using those that already are working with the scientific opinions themselves. And one can also ask members of the scientific panel to be part of the expert group, because they are eventually going to adopt and accept the output from the scientific opinion in the panel. And the people who are part of this working group, they are there because they are experts on the topic. So in a sense, they comply with the requirements of the experts to support an EK. One can also say, as a consequence of this, one does not have specific EK sessions or workshops. One is planning explicitation as part of the working group meetings. It could happen that one has to add additional meetings to accommodate the EK sessions, but in principle, there are no. It is part of the on the basic working group meetings. It could be that one has to divide the working groups into two different groups, one working on exposure and one working on toxicity, and then they can sort of meet the next time. And another, what we see in the use of this formal EK is that the question is usually about assessing the combined impact of sources of uncertainty. So it is about elicitation of overall uncertainty. That is when semi-formal EK is used. As I said, it's the most important question in the opinion, not one of intermediate importance. And we also see that these questions are often categorical, like the answer to a yes/no question. And if one goes back to the EFSA EK guidance, it was originally written for input parameters to a model where the experts are assessing quantiles and one is fitting distributions. But I mean, in essence, it's not a difference assessing a single probability of a yes/no question versus a distribution. But it's mentioned on a small, like a footnote in the EK guidance, that the question could actually be categorical as well, but it doesn't have a big role in the EK guidance as such. One thing that we see is that the consensus judgment coming out from a semi-formal EK can be in form of an approximate probability, and we also see that the experts can, from the beginning, make their individual judgments as an approximate probability. And this is also something that was not in the EK guidance. And these approximate probabilities is that instead of they say that their probability that the question yes is, let's say, 60%. And this approximate probability, it is introduced, and now I have an unstable connection, so I hope you can still hear me. It is introduced as part of the characterization of uncertainty, that for the purpose of decision making, it can be sufficient to express the conclusion or uncertainty the conclusion using approximate probability rather than precise probabilities. And this has then percolated back that the expert then can from the beginning make the judgments in an approximate way. So on the next slide, I have I'm referring to indication of uncertainty, where they suggest how to harmonize how uncertainty is communicated in EFSA opinions. So first of all, we saw that the uncertainty conclusion should be expressed quantitatively, and then what one can say is that we have these quantitative expressions in terms of percent probability for the answer to a yes. The experts, or it can be advisable to sort of accompany a quantitative expression with a verbal expression. And then these tables are then meant to help, like which verbal expression should we choose for a certain subjective probability. But the use of this subjective probability or approximate probability scale has also resulted that the experts feel that, okay, it's enough that we say some is between 90 and 95. We can always pick that range. We don't have to select a certain probability within range. And then we use the verbal expression for that. And this is also saying that if you communicate that the certainty conclusion is at least 50%, or if you're not able to even provide a conclusion, it's very inconclusive, it sort of gives guidance on the harmonized use here. And this table, this probability scale, is a modification of the scale that is used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So approximate probabilities are definitely not in the original EFSA guidance. I can also see that any combination or modification of the 3 protocols introduced in the EFSA guidance can be seen as a semi-formulaic. Okay, so let me just give an example of how the communication can look like. This is from the biomass panel again, the use of so-called superchilling technique for transport of fresh fishery products. And I just made an extract here from the abstract. And if you go down here to the right, you can see that the conclusion is framed that with 99 to 100% certainty. And then they picked the expression from the probability scale, almost certain, and then comes the conclusion. So this is an example of how the conclusions are communicated. And since the experts this is more or less directly the consensus judgment coming out when, in this case, a semi-formulaic is applied to reach the conclusion on that particular question. So I just want to wrap up here and say that the so-called semi-formulaic, it's not a specific protocol for expert elicitation. It was introduced as part to accommodate the need to make expert formal or a structured expert judgment fit for purpose in an EFSA context. And in particular, when you have the requirement to characterize uncertainty in the conclusion and you need expert judgment to do it, they saw that we need to do something here that so we can actually use formal procedures for making these judgments, but we can't really comply with what's in the EFSA guidance as such. So that's where the semi-formulaic comes from, but it's not a specific protocol as such. It is an adaptation, and different uses of expert judgment, as I mentioned, in plant health, animal health, welfare, and biohazard, they look very different across EFSA. And we can also see that the minimal requirements that were described in the principle and methods underlying the uncertainty analysis guidance, they were actually proposing they're very formal. It's sort of describing to me a very formal process. So if those requirements would be met, I would not be too worried. But one can also see that what happens when we introduce the possibility of making judgments in an approximate way. What are the consequences of that the experts themselves are part of the working group, that they actually are producing they are part of working with the problem formulation from the beginning. They are writing the evidence dossier, they are working on it, and then they do the elicitation later on. So they have been discussing from the beginning with each other as part of this, as it's being done in working groups. What are the consequences of that? And is there a way to sort of ensure that the judgments are still as unbiased as possible? And I'm sorry to say so, but it's very difficult to sort of use mathematical aggregation that allow any behavioral aggregation parts. You also see now it's unstable again. But it would be very useful if one would sort of review and provide more guidance on what the minimum requirements and how to adopt the use of EKI fit for purpose in EFSA assessments. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to discuss more with you. I didn't sort of put more information into the slides because I want to sort of have more an interactive discussion where I can add more information based on your questions. So thank you so much.